Você já pensou que pode existir uma ética na alimentação? Que talvez o que está à nossa disposição nas prateleiras dos supermercados esteja levando o nosso planeta a sofrer danos irreparáveis? O filósofo Peter Singer nos leva a uma reflexão sobre as práticas de produção dos alimentos e de como nossos hábitos alimentares influenciam o meio ambiente e nosso bem-estar. Num mundo onde é preciso alimentar bilhões de pessoas, é importante repensar os rumos da produção de alimentos.
So, let me begin with this question of the impact that what we eat has on non-human animals. Obviously, this has been an interest of mine for quite a long time now. It's more than 40 years since I started thinking about the ethics of how we ought to treat animals. And there's been a lot of discussion about that, but I'm convinced that the basic ideas that I put forward are right and, in fact, have been more widely accepted over that 40-year period than they were when I started thinking about this issue. The essential idea is that we are not justified in failing to consider the interests of a being simply because that being is not human. That is, simply because that being is not a member of our species. If a being is conscious, if it has interests in how well its life goes, that is, if the being's life can go well or badly from the perspective of that being, then that being ought to count, and those interests ought to count. So, for example, if the being is in pain or the being suffers, we ought to think of that as a bad thing, just as we would think that the pain and suffering of human beings is normally a bad thing. We do wrong if we say, well, because it's not a human being, its pain or suffering doesn't matter, or if we say that its pain and suffering matters less than a similar amount of suffering experienced by a human being. Unfortunately, the normal attitude that most people still have to animals does not give this equal weight to the interests of the animals. It gives either no weight or much less weight to the interests of the animals. And I think that this is wrong. I use the term speciesism to refer to this attitude of prejudice against beings on the grounds that they're not members of our species. And as you can guess, that term speciesism is intended to suggest parallels with phenomena that we're more familiar with, like racism and sexism. So we're familiar with the ideas that some white people in particular have had, though perhaps not only white people, that only members of their race really count, really important. And we're entitled to use members of other races in ways that suit us but are clearly harmful to them. And the most glaring case, obviously, would be enslaving them. And men have often had somewhat similar views about women, that their interests don't count as much as those of men do. Now, we generally agree that that's wrong when it comes to racism and sexism now. But we have not really grappled with the idea that there's a similar kind of wrong, not exactly the same, of course, but a similar kind of wrong if we say that, well, our species is what's really important. It's the only thing that really matters. And if you're outside that species, then ethically, it's not really a problem what we do to you. You don't really count ethically. I think that, as I say, is wrong and not defensible, not justifiable. And I think it's clearly important to see that the non-human animals that we eat are conscious beings, sentient beings who can feel things. Because basically, the animals that we eat or whose products we use are vertebrates. So they're either birds or mammals or fish. And their nervous systems are very similar to ours. They show pain behavior in ways that we do. We have an evolutionary connection with them. And I think it's really implausible to suggest that they're not capable of suffering. If you were going to ask me about insects or something, that would be a different question, much more difficult to establish, say, that insects feel pain. But, you know, with the exception maybe of honey from bees, generally we don't eat a lot of insects, I guess. In some cultures, more insects are consumed. But let's say that I'm focusing largely on the vertebrate animals that we do eat. So I think they do feel pain. And unfortunately, in producing them for food or in capturing them for food, we don't really give much, if any, attention to their suffering or their well-being. Now, I said much, if any, because it's true that most societies have some laws requiring more humane slaughter than used to happen in the past. So animals will go through modern slaughterhouses and they will be generally stunned in some way before they're actually killed. And that's more humane, certainly, and that's a good thing. But firstly, this doesn't happen for all the animals we eat. Most notably, it doesn't happen for fish, because there really is no general practice of humane killing of fish. They're usually just hauled up out of the water and allowed to slowly suffocate, which must be a painful death. But when it comes to the land animals that we rear in farms, the problem is not so much the moment of slaughter itself, which is a brief period in their lives, but the lives as a whole, which last, of course, a much longer time. And over the last 50 or so years, we have developed new methods of industrial farming which do enable us to produce products like chicken in particular would be the greatest example, but also pig products, pork and ham and bacon, as well as eggs, and to some extent even dairy products. It enables us to produce them more cheaply and on a large scale, but at the cost of depriving them of any kind of natural life. So that whereas previously the chickens would be kept in a small flock in a farmyard and they would have room to move around and they would search for insects or grains, in a modern chicken factory, they will be inside a huge shed with maybe 20,000 other chickens all crowded in there. And if you walk into the shed and look at it, at first glance, it seems like it's just got a thick white carpet on it. And that's just the white feathered chickens covering the entire floor. There's no individual veterinary attention at all. If they, for example, collapse, if their legs collapse under them, which does happen because they're bred to grow so fast that their immature leg bones don't keep them up, they will just sit there without access to food or water until they die of thirst or starvation. And eventually somebody may walk through the shed and pick up the corpses. But it just would not pay to give them any kind of veterinary attention. They're just not worth that much. And they're under stress for their entire lives in such crowded environments which they have never evolved to cope with. Similarly, the hens that lay our eggs are kept in small wire cages, again very crowded. They can't even stretch their wings in those cages. The cages are too small to allow them to stretch their wings. Pigs are also often reared indoors, particularly the breeding sows, the mothers of the pigs sold for their meat, very closely confined, sometimes so that they can't even turn around, and just kept on bare concrete because that's the easiest and cheapest thing to keep clean, and to provide them with something like straw would just add extra expense, and from the producer's point of view, there's no point in doing that. So these huge systems pay no attention to the interests of the animals. They're only geared to profit. And any suffering will only be taken into account if it in some way reduces profit, which unfortunately you have to go a long way and cause very extreme distress very often before you do reduce profit. So I think this is an entirely unethical system. It's a system which is geared to treating sentient animals as if they were just things, as if we were just producing some pieces of plastic in a factory or something of that sort. I don't think it can be defended. Not all animals are produced in such bad conditions. Cattle typically do have more room to move around, and you could perhaps say that's more defensible. There's just huge numbers of animals that are being produced in this way. According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the number of land animals produced for food now is 64 billion each year. So we're talking about, say, 7 times the world's maybe 8 or 9 times the world's population in animals being reared and killed for food. And that doesn't include fish, which would add many more animals to the number killed, although fish, at least if they're wild-caught fish, we haven't interfered with their lives, we've only killed them in painful ways. But I think that's also not acceptable. And more fish are being farmed, and that farming is also quite intensive. So the overall picture will be that food is an ethical issue because we have choices as to what we're going to eat. And the choices that we make have consequences for all of these things that I've mentioned. And therefore, it is an important ethical issue to choose in a way that will lead to the best consequences overall for the issues that I'm talking about.
Desde o início da civilização, a relação entre homens e animais não se deu de forma igualitária. O que antes era considerado animal de caça ou de criação para nosso alimento, tornou-se uma produção em larga escala e industrializada. Com o aumento da população humana, foi necessário também aumentar a produção de alimentos. Mas, segundo Peter Singer, a forma como isso se deu gerou grande desequilíbrio ambiental. Você já se perguntou qual seria a relação entre a carne que você come e o aquecimento global?
Para se ter uma ideia, a produção de 1 quilo de carne bovina equivale ao gasto de combustível de um carro rodando 65 quilômetros. E a pecuária é uma das principais causadoras da emissão de gases de efeito estufa.
Para Peter Singer, se não é possível reverter as forças do sistema capitalista de produção de alimentos, a mudança de nossos hábitos alimentares é fundamental. É esse tipo de atitude que está ao nosso alcance.
The way in which we obtain food is a very significant contributor to climate change. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization a few years ago put out a report that was called Livestock's Long Shadow. And that report concluded that the greenhouse gas emissions from livestock production are greater than the greenhouse gas emissions from the entire transport sector, from all of the cars we drive, all of the trucks on the roads, all of the trains, all of the ships, and all of the aeroplanes. All of that is less than the greenhouse gases we produce through raising animals for food. In fact, raising animals for food comes in second in terms of greenhouse gas production, with energy production being the only thing that's ahead of it. And since here in Brazil, you produce a lot of your energy through hydroelectricity generation, which does not produce greenhouse gases, but you are a very big producer of livestock, and in particular of beef, this makes the role of livestock production, specifically in Brazil, even more significant than it is for the world as a whole. So it's certainly something that needs to be considered. What can be done about this? Well, I said earlier that cattle typically are not as intensively reared as chickens and pigs, and so one might think that they're therefore more ethically defensible in terms of the interests of the animals, not causing them suffering. But unfortunately, from the greenhouse gas point of view, cattle are significantly worse than pigs and chickens, and pigs and chickens are actually worse generally than producing grains or vegetables. So why are cattle worse? There are a number of reasons for this. The most obvious one is that their digestive system produces methane. Methane is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas, much more powerful than carbon dioxide. So even though the quantities produced are not so large, it has a very significant effect on changing the climate. So to produce 1 kilo of beef, you produce about as much greenhouse gases as if you drove a car something like 65 kilometers, normal car. And if you compare that with the amount that you produce when you grow grains or potatoes, it's very small. It might be a kilo of potatoes might be equivalent to driving a car just a handful of kilometers, just maybe 2 or 3 or 4 kilometers. So there's a very big discrepancy here. And there doesn't seem to be really a way of changing this. Some scientists have worked with ways of trying to reduce the cow's methane emissions, but nothing really has succeeded at this stage. And that's not the only factor to think about either. Another important factor is that we feed these animals large amounts of grains and soybeans, and therefore they use the food value that we feed them not just to convert it like on a one-for-one basis into something we can eat, but they use it in order to get energy, to keep themselves warm, to move around, to develop bones, which we don't eat, or other parts of their bodies that we don't eat. So we're actually wasting quite a bit of the food value of the grains and soybeans that we've produced. And that also involves energy. That involves fossil fuel, producing these crops. Fossil fuel for making fertilizers, fossil fuels for the various farm operations, sowing, harvesting, and so on. So if we want to be efficient, we would eat these grains and soybeans ourselves and get the maximum amount of food value from them. If instead we feed them to animals, then we've got to grow a lot more and we've got to use a lot more fossil fuel in the process of doing so. So that's why I think we can't really justify beef production when we think of this from a climate change point of view. And why this is an ethical issue. In terms of the impact that we're having on our planet, we are already in danger of getting beyond the limit that was agreed to by all of the nations of the world at the initial Earth Summit, which of course was held in 1992 here in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, where all of those nations, including the United States and China and India and Brazil too, naturally, agreed that they would try to prevent what they called dangerous anthropogenic climate change. So dangerous changes to the climate caused by human activity.
A Eco 92 foi uma conferência das Organizações das Nações Unidas sobre o meio ambiente e o desenvolvimento sustentável, um conceito relativamente novo à época que reuniu mais de 100 chefes de Estado. A Eco 92 teve tanta visibilidade e adesão de países que a reunião seguinte em Joanesburgo, na África do Sul, foi apelidada de Rio Mais 10. E em junho de 2012, sediamos no Brasil a Rio Mais 20. O objetivo do encontro foi verificar se houve avanços em relação às cúpulas anteriores e o que ainda precisa ser feito para que os países se tornem, de fato, sustentáveis.
But we haven't really stopped producing greenhouse gases, and we are now rapidly reaching the point where this is becoming dangerous, where it's changing the climate already, but causing, with a very high degree of certainty, much bigger changes that will occur over the next century. So that although the planet has already warmed a little bit, it is inevitably going to warm quite a lot more because the greenhouse gases are already up there in the atmosphere and we have no way of taking them out of the atmosphere really that is going to be feasible on a big enough scale for what we've done. So this will mean things, not only warming of some parts of the world, but it will mean things like a change in rainfall patterns, not in very predictable ways. It will mean things like a rise in sea levels. And if you think about the consequences of this, I think they're going to be pretty bad for everyone because obviously people have settled and grown food in places where the rainfall is favourable, and they farm rich, fertile delta regions that are quite close to sea level. But it's going to be worst for the world's poorest people. They are the ones who are least going to be able to defend themselves against this, because it's in the poorer nations that the majority of people are farmers, small farmers, who rely on what they grow in order to feed themselves and their families. And mostly they rely on rainfall to grow those crops. So if the rainfall patterns change, if, for example, the Asian monsoon weakens and produces less rain over India and Bangladesh and other parts of Asia, there will be hundreds of millions of small farmers who will not be able to grow their food. And similar things might happen in parts of Africa. And then you can add to that the people, tens of millions of people, as I say, in the low-lying delta regions of the Bangladesh, say, or the Mekong, or of the Nile, whose land will become inundated by rising sea levels. So it's likely that we will have hundreds of millions of climate refugees over the next century. And where are they going to go? At the moment, nations of the world are not very open in accepting refugees. We already have a refugee problem. So the problem is only going to get worse. That's why this is such an urgent issue, and that's why if we can make choices in what we eat that will reduce the prospects of this disaster happening, we should make those choices. It's not necessarily enough, obviously. We have to try to cut back greenhouse gas emissions from all kinds of sources, but I think we should be doing everything we can, and changing our diet is one of the important things that we can do to reduce greenhouse gases. Obviously, you know, with the greenhouse gas issue particularly, a reduction in meat is going to help, even if you don't eliminate it. The problem really is the number of cattle that we have on the planet, and if we were to cut that in half, well, that would make a big improvement, just as if we were to cut the amount of coal or oil that we burn in half, those would also make big improvements. So we don't have to think of it as a kind of all or nothing thing, that everybody in the world has to become vegan or else we haven't achieved anything. On the contrary, if we reduce that, we will have achieved things both for the climate and for reducing animal suffering. So, you know, even if you just went one day a week without meat, you would be doing something significant, would be worth doing. And we may go in this direction. But I think in the long run, actually, at least in affluent societies, we probably will find more alternatives and more replacements. Maybe it'll be the in vitro meat that I mentioned earlier. Maybe it'll be something else. And so we could replace that. Just as maybe a couple of 100 years ago, if somebody had said, there's a lot of cruelty to horses when they have to pull wagons, but it's utopian to imagine that people are going to stop using horses to pull wagons. Well, technology more or less solved that problem, and we don't have such cruelty to horses now, although obviously we have other problems with the internal combustion engine.
Será que produzir mais, como fazemos hoje em larga escala, significa maior acesso aos alimentos de qualidade?
Bebida é água, comida é pasto. Você tem sede de quê? Você tem fome de quê? A gente não quer só comida. A gente quer comida, diversão e arte. A gente não quer só comida, a gente quer saída para qualquer parte.
One of the things that I've said is that eating some kinds of animal products in particular is going to accelerate global poverty by making it more difficult for small farmers to produce food. So that's a clear connection with global poverty. Another thing that I've already mentioned is that we are feeding a large amount of our grains and soybeans to animals, and that this is not an efficient way of feeding ourselves. And this is what is happening to the crops you grow here in Brazil. Brazil, of course, is a huge producer and a huge exporter of soybeans. But the majority of these soybeans are not directly eaten by humans. They're fed to animals, and the animals then in turn are eaten by humans. And if they're fed to beef cattle, for instance, we get back only about 10% of the food value of the soybeans or grain. If they're fed to chickens, we do a bit better. We get back maybe a third of the food value. But there is no animal that we eat, that we feed grain to, that gives us back even half of the food value of what we're feeding. So the significance of this for global poverty is that we could produce a lot more food, or we would have a lot more food available if we did not feed this to animals. And therefore, we would contribute to a lowering of world food prices. And in recent years, there have been fluctuations in world food prices, but they have, by and large, risen. And the World Bank estimates that more people have been made hungry because of the rise in food prices, because they can no longer afford the food that when they don't produce it themselves. So we ought therefore to be thinking about using the food we produce more efficiently, enabling more of it to flow to world markets, not having the affluent people of the world absorbing so much of it indirectly by eating the animal products which it goes into, but rather making it easier for people without very much money and who do not produce their own food to absorb, to buy that food on the world market. So that would be an important contribution, again, to reducing global poverty, reducing hunger and malnutrition. That also leads to one more specific thing about the ethics of food that I want to mention. We do buy some food from developing countries, from poorer countries, but very often they are forced to accept very low prices for what they sell because they're in a weak bargaining position against larger corporations or buyers in their area. There is one way in which we can avoid that, and that is by looking for fair trade labelled products. There's a worldwide movement to establish fair trade standards, which essentially means that the producers can earn enough to have a living income, that is, an income on which they can live and on which they can support their families. And there are some other conditions as well, including conditions that prevent sexual harassment in the workplace and provide decent working conditions for workers on plantations. So I think that this is a positive step, the fair trade movement. It's very big in coffee, of course, of which Brazil is a big producer. That was initially the first product that became well established in the affluent world, and it spread to tea and coffee. But now there are hundreds of products that you can buy in stores, depending a bit on which country you're in. There are hundreds of products that are fair trade labelled, and I think that they're a good thing to look for. I think they are an indication of a product that has been ethically produced in terms of giving a fair return to the workers who've produced it, and that's something that I believe we should all do.
O Fair Trade, traduzido como comércio justo, é um movimento internacional que busca estabelecer padrões sociais e ambientais na cadeia produtiva, promovendo preços justos e o encontro de consumidores com produtores responsáveis, além de favorecer a agroecologia com sua produção orgânica.
The problem, though, is, of course, that we have a system that is really built around profit. We have a capitalist system, and it's very difficult to bring ethics into the marketplace if you're competing with other competitors that are not ethical. So what are our options here? I mean, you could say, well, let's get rid of capitalism and have a more ethical system of production. It's a nice idea, but so far it hasn't really worked anywhere. Certainly capitalism is extremely successful at being productive, at producing the goods that we need to eat and to live comfortable lives. And I don't see any real sign that people are going to reject that for some rather speculative alternative that might be more ethical but might also be much less productive. So the only other way of dealing with this problem is to have laws or regulations so that what we have is a more ethical arena in the marketplace. So that, for example, if you treat your animals better, let's say you don't have your hens in cages, but you allow them room to run around, your eggs will not be undercut in price by somebody else who does have his hens in cages and therefore gets them more cheaply because the labour costs are lower. So if, in other words, you had a law that says that hens must be free to walk around and to stretch their wings and do the other things that come naturally to hens, then nobody could compete in that way, and you could have a more ethical egg producer. And in fact, that has started to happen to a small degree in some places. In the European Union, for example, the whole of the European Union, 27 different nations, 450 million people, they, a year or two ago, banned the standard cages for keeping egg-laying hens. That doesn't mean that all of the hens can run around freely. Unfortunately, it's not that good. But they did require more space. They required that the hens have a kind of a little nesting box to lay their eggs in, which again is a natural instinct that they have to lay in a sort of nesting area. So they made some improvements. And so all of the producers therefore become just a little bit more ethical because they don't have to compete with producers who use the same battery cages that are being used here or that are standardly being used still in the United States, for instance. So that's really the kind of change you need. You need to have political and legal change to produce more ethical consumption. Climate as a whole issue is on the agenda. I don't think that greenhouse gas emissions from livestock are very much on the agenda. In fact, I saw before I came here a Brazilian study. I can't remember the name of the scientist, I'm sorry, who did it. It was by that you have this INPE, Scientific Institute. It was by somebody there who did a study of the Brazilian press coverage of greenhouse emissions in Brazil and showed that there was quite a lot of coverage of greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel use, but very little coverage of greenhouse gas emissions from livestock even though that is a major contributor here in Brazil. So I think that specific aspect of climate change does need to get put on the agenda in a whole lot of nations where people are not sufficiently aware of it. But you said, well, can we get animal welfare more on the agenda? I think the answer is clearly yes, when enough people demand that of their politicians. That's what has to happen. And animal welfare has, in the last decade or so, been on the agenda in Europe quite clearly. As I said, Europe has made some small but significant reforms in farm animal welfare. And that's because people do vote on that basis. The political parties compete with each other for saying, we have a good animal welfare proposal, good animal welfare policy statement. That's really helped. That's made these changes possible. So I think you need to have that. You need to have an educated and concerned public which will treat this as a political issue. And clearly you need then to have organizations that are starting to make this a political issue. It's also happening in the United States to some extent, that at least in some states, animal welfare is becoming is part of the political agenda. But perhaps somehow it's more culturally relative, and perhaps in Brazil it hasn't quite got to that point yet. Certainly, it unfortunately hasn't got to that point in China, which is increasing its meat production a lot. But it does have an animal movement. I was there last year, and there were animal rights activists and vegetarians at Chinese universities I spoke at. But politically, it certainly hasn't got on the national agenda, and these things need to happen. I agree.
O que é preciso fazer para garantir alimentos de qualidade e baratos? Peter Singer nos dá dicas. Selecionar melhor o que compramos, resgatar receitas de nossos pais e avós e lutar por uma produção sustentável de alimentos. Agora, ele nos fala o que pensa sobre os alimentos transgênicos.
I'm not really convinced that there is a problem about transgenic food production. I think it's still an open question. So what are the worries about transgenic food production? Essentially, there are two different types of worries. One is that there will be a problem for our health with eating, say, either grains or soybeans that are genetically modified. And the other is that there will be some kind of environmental escape of a genetically modified plant that will get into the natural environment and will confer some advantage on it. Maybe it will be resistant to pests, and therefore it will spread, and so we will have a super weed which will get out of balance with the rest of the environment. Well, as far as the health issues are concerned, I think that there isn't really clear evidence of a danger to our health in eating transgenic foods. A lot of people have been doing that now for quite a few years. I mean, you can't really exist in the United States without eating genetically modified products because it's genetically modified wheat or corn or soybeans is in so many products. It would be very difficult not to. But I haven't seen any studies that have really clearly shown a link between that and some health problems. I'm not saying that there isn't. I know that there are some studies that have suggested some problems, but they've not really been very large ones and not been, I think, sufficiently clear-cut to say that there is a health problem. A third issue that I might mention is so far, really, at least on a commercial scale, the genetic modification has really been of plants. We are now starting to have genetic modification of animals with genetically modified salmon, I think the first commercially released product. There could be problems here. There could be problems with interbreeding here too, and there could also be problems with the well-being of the animal at some point. So far, again, we don't really know enough about this, so I think it's an issue that we ought to watch closely, but it's not an issue that I could say at the moment is clearly causing some kind of big ethical problem.
Veganismo é uma visão de mundo com convicções éticas baseadas nos direitos dos animais, que evita sua exploração e o abuso. Os veganos excluem da sua dieta quaisquer alimentos que contenham ingredientes de origem animal.
Do I recommend this? Yes, I think this is the most ethical diet in a way in the world as it is today. That's why I do it. I also think it's a healthy diet, and there's a lot of evidence about that. And I don't really think it is realistic to think that everybody is going to go vegan somehow, overnight. It is going to be a long-term process if it happens at all, and will depend on the availability of alternatives for people. So that's why I'm prepared to encourage people to take the first steps. And I think that is a way of making progress in itself and a way of getting people more used to meals that are not based around meat. And then it becomes easier for them to say, oh, well, I've gone, I'm having 1 day a week without meat, but that's easy and I'm enjoying it. Maybe I'll have 2 or 3 days, and maybe they'll end up having 7 days a week without meat. It's a way of getting there, I think. It's interesting because in a way, poorer people have traditionally eaten less meat. I mean, it varies a bit from society to society. But, I take it that the black beans and rice is a sort of standard Brazilian dish that many people who can't afford to eat meat have been eating. Just as in India, they would eat lentils and rice, dal, and so on. And in China too, the poorer people have eaten very little meat, and that's why meat consumption is rising now, because people are getting wealthier. So part of the answer would be we can go back to these quite traditional and quite inexpensive dishes. And they are quite healthy dishes, because in all of the things you get your protein from the beans or the lentils, you get your carbohydrates from the rice or bread or whatever else it might be. There's a good balance there, and if there's traditional knowledge of how to cook them, then that should work all right. Obviously, there can be other things that people can get for some variety. In some societies, the problem is that people seem to have forgotten how to cook. This is seriously, this is a problem in the United States, in poorer parts, where people who really have much less money actually buy more processed and prepaid foods, which are much more expensive per kilo or per food value that you're getting. But if you told them, well, this is how you make a tasty dish of beans and rice, perhaps they would make it. But that traditional knowledge has somehow been lost. So perhaps what we need are educational programs to remind people of these ways of living a healthy and inexpensive life on those basic staples, garnished with variety from other things, but with those kinds of things being the core of the meal. And then it's not a problem for poor people. You certainly can live very inexpensively on a vegetarian or vegan diet. There's a very good organization in the United States called Vegan Outreach, which tries to educate people about vegan diets and gives out a lot of information. And it does have some success. But, here's an organization that has, I don't know, maybe it has an annual budget of $500,000. So how does that compare with how much the big food corporations spend on promoting meat and eggs and dairy products that they're selling? I mean, they're spending billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars a year on selling that message that you should eat a McDonald's hamburger, or you should eat some other kind of meat or animal product. So it's going to be very hard to counter that, and unless you were in some way to control the advertising for meat in the way that typically the advertising for cigarettes is controlled, then maybe you'd start to make some headway. But it would take a lot of political will to do that. So I don't see this as happening yet. I think It's still, I hate to say this, but I think it's still worth trying to make the lives of animals killed for food better, reduce their amount of suffering, because I think that's going to be happening for quite a few years yet. And of course I support efforts to reduce the amount of animals that are raised and killed for food as much as possible, but it's going to take some time before we succeed in that. At the foundation of this is the idea of being willing to put yourself in the position of the other. And that is true, of course, about ethics in general. It's the idea that is expressed in the Jewish and Christian traditions as doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. So if you take that seriously, you have to think, well, how would I like it if I were in their position and somebody was doing to me what I'm now thinking about doing to them? And that's not only part of the Jewish and Christian traditions, it's actually something that you can find in the most thoughtful and reflective ethical writings of a wide range of traditions, including ones quite independent of the Western traditions, like in Chinese ethics or in Indian ethics. You find this idea that people have to do this for non-human animals as well as for humans, for the ethical argument that I made, the first of the arguments against for ethical eating, to hold. But not everybody does that, and even some people who have companion animals, quite strangely, I think, do that a lot for their dog or cat, and then don't think about it at all for the chicken or pork that's on their plate, and never really imagine or ask themselves, what did that animal go through? They don't even really think of what's on their plate as having been the flesh of a living animal that had some experiences. So the first thing we have to do is make people aware of that, make people aware that if they're eating meat, that was part of a living animal. And then they can ask the question, put yourself in that place. Now, I think most people are prepared to do that, but it's true that I've had some people who just say, well, I don't care about chickens. And then the problem is, what do you say to someone who just says, I don't care about chickens? Maybe I empathize with dogs or cats, I like them, but chickens I don't feel anything about. Then I think you really have to try to say that the fact that a being is suffering, the fact that a being is in pain, even if you don't particularly like that being, that's a reason to stop that pain or to try to prevent that pain happening in future to similar beings. I think really there is something objective and based in reason about ethics, and that is that there are some things that are bad, like suffering great pain, and there are some things that are good, like enjoying your life. Maybe not everybody is going to admit that, but there are some points where it's hard to persuade everybody, but I think you can probably persuade most people that pain is a bad thing and that it's a bad thing whether or not they like the being or feel some particular emotional link to the being who is in pain.
O convite está feito. A gente não quer só comida. A gente quer saber de onde vêm esses alimentos e como eles são produzidos. Isto é tão importante quanto saber suas qualidades nutricionais. Ético é quem se preocupa com o bem da coletividade, e nela incluem-se os animais. Esta e outras palestras você encontra no site da CPFL Cultura.
Como sugerir estratégias para promover a inclusão da questão animal nas agendas políticas.
Do I recommend this? Yes, I think this is the most ethical diet.
Eu não acredito que o alimento que vem de origem vegetal também seja isento dessas violações à ética.